Well, good to see you again, and just listening in a little bit on the conversation before lunch. Sounds like there's lots of discussions on the future of also of democracy and of how we govern. Now, the background for what I'll share with you is actually a question that happened when I was leading Reglab, the Danish government's policy lab, and I understood after a couple of years that you can throw very nice tools and methods and processes and designers and anthropologists at public organizations, but not much happens if somebody in a management position is not there to take it and use it and run with it and create organizational change. So I asked myself, how could we learn more about, from the perspective of managers, people who are making decisions, how does this kind of future-oriented, design-led, innovation, citizen engagement work, how does that function for them? And what does it take to have success? And then I also thought I need some lifelong learning. So I designed my own PhD project, and it turned out to end up being 6 years, a long time, more than 6 years, on actually writing a PhD thesis about design methods in government, leadership, and the future of governance. So that became also into a book, but it also became into a very short slideshow that I'll share with you now, at least part of it. And so one framing that came out of the work was that these leaders are interviewed in 5 different countries, in Denmark, in Australia, in America, in the UK, and in Finland. They were somehow, all of them, more interested in future making than in decision making. And I thought for myself also, we've been writing an article for Harvard Business Review about this, my advisor and myself, that the notion of being a future maker sounds kind of nice, but also a bit scary maybe as a public manager. How many of you are in management positions or are leading other people? And those of you who are not leading other people, you have managers that you have to help lead, or you have teams of projects that you have to lead. So, backdrop, of course, is the turbulence, the changes we're seeing, all the context we talked about earlier today. But then, as a manager or as a designer, as a manager, how do you act? And this quote here is one of my all-time favorites on this topic. You can read it twice if you want to just. Dick Boland, who was one of the authors of this great book, highly recommended, was also one of my thesis advisors. How many of you sometimes feel like this? How many of you feel like this is your situation as a manager? It's okay if you're fine. If you're fine, then I'd like to talk to you afterwards, because then you are very special. Because mostly when I speak with managers, I also do leadership training with the European Union, with Oxford and others. It's often like this, that we know we must act, but how do we judge before we act, before we make decisions, what's the best thing to do? And for all the talk in new public management, as we talked about earlier today, about evaluations and evidence and best practices, it still seems as if they are poor guidance for future-oriented, forward-looking decisions. So you could say that managing is to make decisions, but the interesting part about designing, and when managers work with design teams and design methods, that it's really about creating the options to make decisions about. And in a way, that's the point, that we often do not ask ourselves, where are decisions coming from? We just make them off the shelf, choose A, B, or C. But what if there was an X or Y or Z out there? And how do we expand the range of options for which to make decisions about? So you can say that's really my fascination with design work, is that what if we combine leaders and managers in government and in business with designers that can help us explore problems prototype solutions, and then we make our decisions. And actually, in some ways, I talked to a colleague over coffee about how do we design out risk, because as soon as we say innovation in the public sector, we also say risk, and we hate risk. But actually, what if there was a way, through iterative prototyping and testing and opening up and closing in and opening up, we can begin to take some of the risk out of something that is still highly innovative. So as mentioned earlier, that I like Herbert Simon. He's the guy to the left, the Nobel Prize winner, who also wrote the book Science of the Artificial, about the difference between the natural sciences and design and the design professions. But I would say that he also had his limitations. And one of his limitations was that he actually framed designing as decision making. And that the acting of designing was actually ultimately to make choices. To make, you could say, design choices. But Herbert, and this is what happens when you have to write a PhD for 6 years, you actually get to read this stuff, and you find out what they actually meant. And he actually did not believe in such a thing as human intuition, or creativity, or imagination. But he argued that when you see something creative happening, or intuitive happening in decision making, it's actually just because people are very, very smart. They are experts, they've tried it before. As opposed to Buckminster Fuller, the other old grey guy on the picture to the right, who said we can actually imagine new futures, and the future is there for us to design. Even our planet, he wrote a piece called A Spaceship Earth, even our planet is actually designed. And as some of you know, we now talk about the Anthropocene, right? The geological age of the human being. We live in the human age. And in a way, Buckminster Fuller, the architect, was a precursor to that conversation. So you can say that it's shifting away from saying what decisions should we make in policy making, in business strategy, but what are we making decisions about? That's a reframing of how we manage. That is, in a way, framing managing as a process of designing. Now, I'm not asking you, all of you, to become designers or even design managers, but just trying to say that the perspective, the prism, this prism of designing can be helpful, especially when we talk about managing into uncertainty and into unknown futures. So you could say that to the right here is what the manager as a future maker would be asking. These are the kinds of questions that we would expect us to ask and think about if we actually are engaged in future-oriented activity, as opposed to, you could call it ongoing operations, day-to-day work, which is also important, which is also very, very important. Maybe 80% of what we do is to the left, or 90%, but the things that we have to do to change things for the future are maybe over on the right side here, and maybe that's where we need to pay a bit more attention at this time in history even. So here is a 375-page PhD in one single slide. Almost. There's another part to it as well, but this is mostly it. So that's of course very depressing to think about. But here you have design practice, right? Exploring problems, ethnographic research, human-centered design. Here we have ideation, brainstorming, creative processes, opening up. And here we have the prototyping, we have the testing out, experimentation, and so forth. These are design methodologies and practices that I also found did happen in those 15 cases in government. But here we have the management practices, ability to challenge assumptions, leverage empathy with citizens and customers, steward change, and so forth. And so these 6, the white bubbles here, those are in about 4 to 5 minutes, we'll take you through a couple of examples of what does that mean. What are these 6 management behaviors or attitudes or practices? What is that about? And I'll just give a sort of a quick tour of some of the examples. So here's the 2 practices, and exploring the problem space. That is the activity, the design activity we're talking about. So here's a COO in a health tech firm. So this is from the business side, from the private sector, that was exploring how a particular medical device would work for patients in medical settings. And where he got new insight was simply to explore in clinics, in practical settings, how would patients, nurses engage in the technology, in the medical device. And this testing and iteration with citizens, with customers, in this case also with nurses and doctors, simply meant that the company had to change direction multiple times along the way, and also testing it, by the way, in different cultural settings. This case example is from the head nurse of a Danish National Hospital, which we worked with when I was leading Reglab. And now, this is a hospital where they're very, very good at fixing people's hearts. It's a heart clinic. But when they began to empathize with patients in terms of their human experience of going through, staying overnight at the ward, preparing for operations, it was a very different story than the professional, high-quality sort of medical story they told themselves as doctors and nurses, because in practice, patients were not having a very good experience. Actually, patients were afraid, confused, didn't sleep very well at night because of noise. There were very, very long waiting times, including an old lady who was driven by ambulance into the hospital, and she thought she was, going to die. Her heart was in trouble. But at the National Hospital, she wasn't actually considered to be very sick because, what the local hospital thinks is sick is not really sick. So at the National Hospital, they put her down in a chair for 3 hours just waiting without telling her anything. And she was, of course, quite worried. So the question they asked was, what would happen to the hospital and to the workflows we have if the patient's time is more important than the doctor's time? How to redesign a hospital around the patients and optimizing their time use and not the doctors and the nurses. But the empathy point I want to get at here is that, so whereas the medical device manufacturer did testing and so on in real life examples, what they did here was, with our help, they did audio recordings of the voices of patient stories. So these are not stories from the future, these are actual patients right now listening to their stories. 20 patients over a course of 2 weeks of observation and ethnography and anthropological fieldwork. And then what the head nurse did, she basically invited a group like this, doctors, nurses, professional staff, and said, this is how our patients experience what we do to them. Listen to this. And then she just played back a voice after voice after voice after voice of patients telling their stories. Short 1 minute, 2 minute sound clips out of course, much, much more material. And by the way, lots of editing and potentially lots of bias in that because, of course, we help to pick what are the stories we're telling, what are the patterns we want to share. But what she said, the head nurse, when she did this, she said, I did this to disturb them. Did this to create a bit of a shock in the organization of all these stories which were not so pleasant to listen to. And that is, the quote here is, it's like seeing the cracks in that ugly little crack in your beautiful white bathroom tiles that you kind of know is there, but you don't, you ignore it. You know there's something not right, but you're ignoring it. And I think, to catalyze change and transformation, not least in government organizations, we sometimes need to actually provoke a bit and bring the voice of patients, of citizens, of users into the conversation. And this is what she did in quite a powerful way. By the way, they did transform workflows. They did also create quite heavy savings by optimizing patients' time. Because if patients don't need to stay the night in hospitals, suddenly you have a very, very big saving. 50% of patients could actually be processed in a single day rather than stay overnight. So the redesign, optimization of workflow started with empathy. Just quickly, a couple of other examples on generating alternative scenarios. Stewarding divergence means how do we deal with open spaces where we are working towards something we still don't know what is. We're still not ready for decision making, we're still in the process of future making. And this example from a manager of a social institution in Denmark saying, it's almost like you're groping for something in the dark. We have a sense of where we should be heading, but we don't know exactly. That is a very, very uncomfortable place to be as a leader, as a manager, because your staff will say, what are we deciding? Where are we going? What's going to happen with this? And you have to say, well, actually, we're just exploring it still. It takes resilience and a lot of strength as a leader not to say, okay, well, we'll do this then, or this is probably it. Another example this is from a school, high school in Denmark, where 9 teachers across 3 different disciplines were invited to co-create and co-design a new curriculum. And at one point they came up to the director, the dean, and said to her, you really let us do this? You know, we've 3 months of work and we're just doing it, and you're not deciding, and you're not asking us to what we're coming up with, and you're allowing us to do it, and you didn't even try to control us in this? And she said to them, no, said to me when I interviewed her, well, I didn't try to control them, and it was a positive loss of control. And how can loss of control in a public sector system be positive? Well, she felt it was positive because she saw that the outcome was radically different than what she could have gotten if she had been directing the process, controlling them, monitoring them, asking for progress reports and all that kind of stuff, giving them metrics on what should come out of it. But how many managers in government see losing control as something positive? It's an attitude issue. It's also a career issue. And of course, for her, it was not a loss of control the whole time. It was part of the process, still, of course. Finally, visualization, making systems, user journeys, interactions visible, using film, using graphics, just makes decisions easier because we can see the same thing. This is one example from a recruitment firm we worked with in a business project. We have other examples. For example, the biggest Danish bank, which is very famous right now for something not so pleasant, whitewashing of money, Danske Bank. They have actually, for a very long time now, worked on only bringing new ideas and innovations and management concepts to decision-making that are visual. So they have had a rule for the last 3 or 4 years that no decision is made on any new product or service that we cannot see. No written reports. Both videos, mock-ups, website, digital, sketches, and so on. It has to be part of it. Final example from Ministry of Business. When we talk about organizational change and changing futures, we often talk about the citizens or the users or the customer. But we have to remember that we need to run, you could say, double-sided change. If we do not also create meaningful new services, processes, interactions for employees, for staff, for the organization, and work on a double-sided change program, designing for the outside, designing for the inside, we cannot achieve long-term, sustainable, meaningful change. Then we're just shifting bureaucracy from us to the citizens, or from citizens back into the system. So this is an example where we created a new digital interaction for businesses, where this is the head of the policy department saying, he insisted that we need his staff to win and citizens, companies to win as well. So with that, I think that if you look at these 15 projects that I researched, plus some of the examples from the business sector, the attitude that drives leadership and management is one about changing things for the better. And that kind of insistence throughout some very complex and difficult and sometimes very political processes is just really, really important. And you could call that a design attitude, as my friends do here. You could also call it a future attitude. But this is what characterizes those I spoke with, who you could say are future makers. Thanks for listening.
So we actually have time for a couple of questions to Christian. Anybody who wants to open up the floor? Otherwise, I'll start off with asking you, in a way you could argue that you focuses on manager and how manager lead change. Would you comment on if I say that the rest of us who are not senior managers also have a, if not leadership role, a leading role? So could you say something about like almost the personal aspect of leadership?
Yeah, so these were people that are at all different levels. Some are director generals, some are head of division, mid-level managers, some are leading institutions, so social care or very big hospital departments. But all of them are, of course, almost all of them, including even the director general, has somebody above them. And so do we, who are not leading classical management teams, but we are leading projects. And I think whether it's a project level, whether it's a department level, whether it's an agency level, whether it's a high-level policy, there's these principles around I sometimes, and this is not my own idea, of course I stole it from someone else, Marco Steinberg from the former Citra Helsinki Design Lab, the idea of stewardship. That you're stewarding, you're not even running it with your own vision, but you are in a way stewarding and allowing for new approaches, new solutions, new services to emerge in a collaborative process. And so I think that the principles and the attitudes involved here goes for everyone who has a role to play, or is given some kind of mandate, you might say, right, for these types of processes. And so I think that the 6 principles are actually relevant to everyone that are mandated with change.
Thank you. Any other questions to Christian?
It's because it's all making so much sense.
Okay, once again, Christian, thank you very much.